Hello everybody. In spite of the fact that I've been doing this job for 7 years now and have driven to date hundreds of cars both on and off the channel, every now and again I still feel like that film buff that's yet to get round to watching The Godfather, because in spite of all the exotica that I've driven, there are still loads of very humble and accessible vehicles out there that I've yet to get my claws into, including those that I've often found myself lusting after. And one such car is the Renault Sport Clio 197. My one would be a liquid yellow, the F1 edition with the little wing on it, if you don't mind. I've been offered a number of them to review over the years, but for various reasons it just hasn't worked out, and I've often thought of buying one for myself, but never even got quite so far as a test drive. Today though, I'm putting that right with this. It's not the Clio Sport 197, it is in fact that car's slightly younger, posher cousin, the Clio Sport 200 Gordini. As is often the case for me, I am once again doing things out of order. You see, I've never driven any of the third generation Clio RS cars, and that includes both the 200 and the 197, but I have driven those that came both before and after. Most recently, I experienced this car's successor, the Clio RS 200 EDC, and that is a somewhat controversial thing because it replaced the naturally aspirated engine of this with a turbo and the manual with a dual clutch box, that is the EDC bit. And though purists will almost certainly swear by this as the last of the proper hot Clios, I have to say I did appreciate the more mature approach that Renault took with the newer car. It felt like a more rounded, more upmarket, a more usable product, but was still a hoot to drive. And looking back, I've also driven a whole host of this car's ancestors, which includes some genuine hot hatch royalty, from the likes of the Clio 172 to the 182 Trophy, the Clio Williams, and even the Renault 5 GT Turbo, which it could be argued may be where the story began. The Renault Sport Clio 197 landed back in 2006. In 2009, it was facelifted into the marginally more powerful 200 with a few more horses, a few more mile an hour on the top speed, no difference in the 0 to 60 time, and some cosmetic and technology enhancements. The Gordini landed in 2010, and the Clio 200 was finished in 2012. Both cars were available in one of two basic configurations, either the more road-biased Sport or the more track-orientated Cup, which featured a lower, stiffer suspension, quicker steering rack, better brakes, and the removal of several interior luxuries, including the air conditioning for a lower weight and therefore higher performance. As this isn't a Porsche, the Cup was actually the cheaper of the two, though just to confuse matters, you could have had your Sport with its luxuries and the extra handling stuff from the Cup, and that's called the full fat Cup and was marginally more expensive than a Sport. The Gordini is what I would term a plaques and stripes special. In other words, there are no mechanical changes compared with a regular Clio Sport 200, but there are plenty of visual ones, including this gorgeous blue paintwork, the distinctive stripe with the Gordini emblem on it, though in places that has begun to fade. You also have these wheels, which were available in a number of different trims, including white. You've got white wing mirrors, you've got Gordini badging, and a very different look for the car at the back, and most prominently up at the front, where you've now got this sort of F1 inspired front splitter, making the Gordini instantly recognizable. This was also intended to be the most luxurious of all Clio 200s, but temper expectations, it's still a Clio, so that means you've still got acres of cheap plastic and slightly iffy switchgear, and the most massive steering column I've ever seen, with some really weirdly stubby wash wipe and indicator stalks as a result. But you do have leather seats, both front and rear, with blue accents and contrast stitching, which I like, a nice full leather steering wheel complete with stripe to echo that on the outside of the car, and a nice big metal knob for you to grab when you want to change gear. There are also some Gordini badging elements throughout the interior, including a plaque in the center console telling you which of the 500 cars made you've got. This one is number 960. As with the regular 200, the Gordini could be had in either Sport or Cup trims, the latter for just £400 more. And today, opinion is still divided as to which is superior, with those favouring the Cup arguing that is the only way to get the full Renault Sport experience, and those who prefer the Sport saying that makes it a much more enjoyable and usable road car. As this isn't a track car, its owner Sal deliberately sought one out with the Sport Pack, her partner Chris having driven a Cup and speaking to me saying that actually it was way too firm for road use. As with every hot hatch, there is a good chance that the Clio may be somebody's one and only car. Therefore, it is, I think, very important to pay attention to the practical aspects, and here the Clio does fairly well. I love the shape of it, and compared with its forebears, it is a little bit more upright. This gives you a reasonable amount of space inside, though I would say it's best treated as either a 3-seater for adults or a 2+2, with plenty of space in the back for kids, but do note this is exclusively a 3-door. How times change. The big shock though is the boot, which is excellent, and I don't think actually that much smaller than an equivalent Megane of the day, the 250 for example. I've currently got a nice full-size airline carry-on as my camera bag, and you'd get 2 of those laying flat for sure, and maybe even 4 if you put them on their side. So for going away for a weekend, this is a very good car. When new, the Gordini commanded around £2,000 over the price of a regular RS 200. Working out exactly what the difference is today can be difficult on account of the relative rarity of the Gordini. They have become something of a collectible, and though there are always people that will argue because the changes are merely cosmetic, it can't be worth any more, you could also say that a 182 trophy is just a 182 with some nice dampers, and yet still people are willing to pay an £8,000 or £9,000 premium for those. This is not a world that makes much sense anymore. However, today, the cheapest RS 200 on Auto Trader is just over the £6,000 mark, and the cheapest Gordini about £11,000. The truth is, that is not a very fair comparison, because the Gordini up for sale is a slightly newer car and with far fewer miles and likely in better condition. This one will soon be going up for sale once it's had the last of its cosmetic work done, which chiefly means getting the alloys refurbed, and when it does go up, I think Chris and Sal are going to be asking around about the £10,000 mark, which means though it's not exactly a cheap car, neither is it extortionately expensive, certainly in today's world. However, these are cars that have never made their reputation based on the way that they look. Instead, they've forged that by the way that they go. How does this fare? Honestly, it's been so long since I've driven a car in this class that I really wasn't sure what to expect. I've driven hot hatches recently, but most of those have been more modern turbocharged affairs, which really compared to this should be called a hyper hatch. But when it comes to something like this, there is actually only one thing you can depend upon. That's the unexpected. You see, these over the years have forged a reputation as a giant killer, and for good reason. You and I both know that in a drag race, this would be easily beaten by just about any hot German saloon of the last 15 or 20 years, to say nothing of a full-blooded Italian supercar. However, as the majority of us in Europe do not live our lives a quarter mile at a time, in the real world, there was actually very little that could hold a candle to the likes of the mighty Renault Sport Clio. And as I've grown older and more experienced in the ways of the automobile, I've come to accept and realise that things like feel, interaction, excitement, and outright speed or grip can be entirely independent things. I've driven plenty of incredibly fast cars that were just soulless, unexciting, unremarkable. You do incredible speeds without a smile on your face. Then you go and hop in something like a 205 GTI, and the fact is, there are shopping carts today that would outrun it. But still, you love it dearly because it makes the act of driving so completely pleasurable. And that's what this should be all about. And if reports from the time are accurate, that is what the car is going to be all about. In a minute, I will put my foot down, but the car still needs to warm through. And so, before then, I'm going to take you through a few of my first impressions, because when I slipped myself into this seat and took it out onto the open road, there were a few things that really did take me by surprise. The first of which is the steering. Now, I'm sure you've read that it's brilliant, and in very many ways it is, and it needs to be. This is a core part of what makes hot hatches quite so fun. However, the surprise here was just how heavy it is. At low speeds, you can appreciate the fact that it does have power steering, but when you begin to move, you get to sort of 10-15 mile an hour, and even a car without power steering would lighten up. This doesn't really seem to. It feels like it's resisting you just about all the time. If you told me it had Pilot Sport Cup 2Rs on it, I'd kinda believe you. It doesn't. It has a fresh set of Pilot Sport 4s. The wheel itself is also very chunky in the hand, comically so at points, though the rim itself isn't too squidgy, so you do still get a decent amount of feel through it. The pedals also are a little bit odd. They're nicely spaced, you can drive this in just about any footwear, but the clutch in particular is very mushy, doesn't give you masses of feedback, though it's far from the worst that I have experienced. The throttle is on the light side, but that's okay, and the brake pedal is certainly the best of the three. Alright, the car's warmed up, we've got a clear bit of road, so let's give it some beans. Perhaps the biggest surprise for me in this car is the engine. It's an absolute firecracker. Reminds me of the old Vauxhall Astra GTE red top, the old 16 valve. In fact, this engine is entirely different from any other used in the Clio lineup of the time, and can trace its roots all the way back to the unit used in the old Clio Williams. From about 2,500 RPM, though it doesn't have turbo-like surge, it does have a bit more punch than you might expect, and get it to between 4 and 5, the car comes on cam, it gains a bit of a second wind, and it's very, very happy to go all the way to that 7,500 RPM red line. The gearbox is really pleasant too, and with French cars you just never know what you're going to get. They alternate between awful and awesome, and happily this is in the latter category. I wish I could say that about the interior as a whole, but the simple fact is I just can't. I get the fact that because it's based on a regular Clio and because they're selling it at a price, it was never going to come with leather from top to bottom, although I do wish they'd done something with this headliner. For the Gordini, I think just even turning this to the same stuff but black would have made a real difference, made it feel that little bit racier, that little bit more special. Okay, probably also a little bit less enjoyable for those in the back, but Sodom. I think the element of the interior that frustrated me the most and did nearly send me mad was the cruise control. You've got buttons for it on the wheel, so you've got your up, down, your off and your resume, but the cruise control itself also needs to be turned on manually, and I was driving this thing for about 10-15 minutes going, well, it's got to be around here. Maybe I just press it and it turns on, or something other. Oh, there's a switch down here. I'll press that. No, that's traction control off, and there's a blank button by there. And I was just going, this is just, I mean, I was about to get the manual out or call Chris and ask him where it was, and then I remembered, because I had the same thing in my Megane. It's down here, next to the handbrake. Of course it is. Why wouldn't it be down there? There is a little beep to warn you you're approaching the red line, and it gives you just about enough time to change gear before you bounce off the limiter, and it's a very, very satisfying thing to do as well. The entire car is standard, exhaust included, meaning it's not particularly raucous, either outside or in, and personally I would probably do a little bit of something with the exhaust to unlock a bit of that classic twin cam sound. However, I will give it some credit because even as standard, when you are driving hard, you do still get the odd little pop and crack out of it. And I do appreciate that, because unlike the Audi R8 that I've just handed back, here it does feel very natural indeed, in that it was entirely synthetic. Put it in sport mode, put your foot down, lift, bop, every single time. This, I feel like I've earned it. The driving position is a little bit weird. Nowhere near as extreme as, say, an Abarth 595, but it's sort of halfway between a normal car and that. In other words, you feel like you're perched on it rather than in it. Now, somewhat offsetting that is the fact these seats are brilliant. I appreciate the fact that they are leather, and in some weird way I think that would mean this, the Gordini, is probably a really good choice if you do have children. because leather is much easier to clean and wipe down than many a fabric. Naturally, the car being tiny, it's relatively easy to place on the road, though you don't have any sort of sensation of where the bonnet is, nor do you have a precise idea of the back of the car, though it doesn't extend that much beyond the rear window. It does extend a little bit, and there are no parking sensors or aid of any kind. And if you're trying to park this car up against something like, oh, let's say an Audi R8, which is very, very low, you have absolutely no concept of where the front of the car behind you is. The suspension is an interesting one. It's certainly on the firm side, you do appreciate that, and I can see exactly why Chris and Sal didn't want to get a car with the Cup chassis. Those are between 20 and 30% stiffer in terms of the spring rate, and that I'm sure you notice. The fact is, at heart, this is still a hotted up city car, and so there was only ever a limited amount that Renault could do in terms of compliance around town if they wanted to retain the sportiness out of it. That being said, Renault did really go to town, because the Clio Sport 200 has not just a different track width compared with the regular Clio, but also a different wheelbase too. These aren't the sort of things that you can alter easily. In order to combat torque steer, Renault also gave this car an unusual front suspension arrangement, which they dub Perfo Hub. I believe it's similar to that Ford used on some of the Hot Focus models, and they called Revo Knuckle. The net result of which being the car isn't supposed to have any torque steer. And it doesn't. Okay, maybe this isn't the greatest achievement when you consider the fact it doesn't have much torque to steer with, but still, it's worked. The car does not have a limited slip differential, but honestly, in all the time I've had it, I haven't really noticed its absence. It is in tighter bends though where this chassis really comes alive and the setup pays dividends. This has always been the traditional hunting ground of the hot hatch. In a corner where in something big, heavy and powerful and rear wheel drive, you'd be calling it a day. Here, you go, no, sod it, put your foot even further into the carpet and the car just seems to find grip from nowhere. It is on roads like this in that sort of 50 to 70 mile an hour bracket where you can really play with the car. The steering does begin to come alive. You can choose your rate of progress and acceleration with the gearbox. That edge of jitter that is present around town vanishes completely and is replaced with a real beautiful compliance and ride quality. The car feels tailor-made for this road, and it really is a fine thing. But it's just not wowing me. I respect it immensely. I like nearly all of the elements. Engine, very good. Gearbox, very good. Chassis, very good. Steering, decent. I actually called it brilliant earlier. I don't think that it is. In any case, compared to a great deal of saloons, performance or otherwise, it's still decent. The interior is okay for the price point. It's reasonable, space is good and all that jazz. You've even got a little bit of technology. You could have an optional Renault Sport monitor, which would give you G information and the like, and I don't think this has that. And you've even got Bluetooth connectivity for both calls and audio streaming, which is nice. But I'm really struggling to fall in love with it. And it's not because I'm anti-hot hatch. I used to be once upon a time, but I've recanted my wicked ways. With this though, I think the issue is that if you want a slightly more exciting, more engaging car, I seem to recall that being the 182. And if you want something really rare, you can get the 182 Trophy for essentially the same money as this, I think. Unless prices on those have gone up even more. Anyway, you can also get, for similar money, maybe a little bit more, the later Clio 200 with the dual clutch box. And though I know a lot of people will discount it just for that and the turbo engine, I felt it was still a great drive and a little bit more grown up, a little bit more livable. On the motorway, this is doing like 3,500 RPM, and though it's not unbearable, that is one reason I never actually wound up buying one of these. I do a lot of motorway miles. It isn't great, and it's not good on fuel, this thing. They have at least had the decency to fit it with an unusually large tank for a car in this class, 55 litres, but it needs it, because the whole time I've had the car, it's averaged 30.6 mpg, and I haven't really driven it that hard, that often. This apparently is just what it gets, and I think 25-year-old me, and to be fair, 33-year-old me, would always struggle with a car that's going to cost let's call it £10,000, for which you could have a nice 3-litre German saloon that would be much more refined, much more comfortable, have many more luxury features in it, a lot more space and a lot more power, maybe similar performance, but more power, and still do the same economy. I think if you were going to track one of these, then they suddenly start to make a whole lot more sense. You get one with the cup suspension, don't even bother with the Gordini, you can pick one up for say 7 or 8 grand, the spares are going to be fairly cheap, and because they haven't got all that much power, you shouldn't chew through components all that quickly. But I'm not the sort of person that goes on track days, and as a road car, I like it, I really like it, okay, but I do not love it. Oh well. It was certainly worth a try, and I am very grateful to Sal and to Chris for bringing it out to me. As ever, I want to say a big thank you to them and to you. Don't forget to hit the like button, comment down below, and subscribe if you haven't already. I'll see you for the next one. Bye-bye.